This past Friday was the release of The Order 1886, one of the most advertised exclusive games for the PS4, and it was immediately met with a lot of negative criticism due to the fact that the game is only 5 hours long, which led to the question, is 5 hours of gameplay worth paying a full $60 for?
What's up Internet, Kevin here, and I've always been of the opinion that a game can be as short as 5 or 6 hours and still be worth paying a little extra for, as long as the content is worth it and it gives you some reason to want to replay it. Sadly though, Order 1886 is not looking like one of those situations. There is a lot I have to complain about this game, but before I get to that, let's start with the one thing I do like about it, and that's its presentation overall.
The game is undoubtedly beautiful. Even when locked at only 30 frames per second, it just looks amazing. There was clearly a lot of attention to detail given in terms of character facial animations, cloth movement, body motions, everything just looks really realistic, making it one of the best looking experiences on the PS4 to date. One other thing the game does that I really like that I think some people have had a bit of a problem with is the fact that it mixes in a lot of cutscenes in between gameplay as a way to help load upcoming game segments. In other words, once you initially load the game up, there are never any loading screens ever. The only time the game is ever going to fade to black is when there's a major scene transition, or if you die and it has to reset up the next segment of gameplay, which personally I really love. It just makes the overall experience much more immersive and keeps you constantly focused on the action rather than ever having to stop and wait for the next segment to load. Now that being said, the visuals are basically the only one big good thing about this game. It's all downhill from here, starting with the mediocre gameplay. Now if you watched my 5 things you should know about Order 1886 video I did just before the game came out, one of the things I observed is that it looks a lot like Gears of War, which is both a good and bad thing in the sense that I really like the core gameplay, but if there's anything the later Gears of War games taught us, it's that gameplay can get very stale very quickly if you don't make use of interesting and varied enemies, weapon types, or level design, and that's exactly what happened in the Order 1886. To begin with, enemies are just simply uninteresting. Almost everyone you fight is just simply another human armed with a kind of gun you could use. Most of the time it's just a regular pistol or assault rifle, occasionally run into a guy with a shotgun or a sniper, but that's about it. Which I think what makes it especially disappointing in this game is the fact that the whole thing is set in this very Victorian horror type setting where you're supposed to be fighting werewolves and other monsters. There's only 3 times you ever fight werewolves in the game with 2 QuickTime event boss fights, and while vampires are featured in the storyline, you never actually encounter them in-game. The rest of the time is spent solely focused on fighting other humans, which just ends up making the whole thing feel very bland. It's made worse by the fact that level design is all very simplistic. Most of the time you just walk up to the first waist-high wall and take your time shooting what enemies are in view, and that's about how every combat will go throughout the entire game. Now, these combat segments are broken up every now and then by stealth segments and werewolf fights, as I said earlier, but sadly, these are actually when the gameplay gets even worse. First off, the werewolf fights. There's 3 of them, and they are all the exact same encounter. Basically, you enter a room, you fight 3 werewolves at once, and there's a bunch of boxes stacked around that create narrow corridors, and all the werewolves do are run at you in turn and run away. So you just shoot one while it runs at you, dodge, watch it run away, watch the next one come up, wash, rinse, repeat until the fight's over. It's some of the most boring, repetitive parts of the game, which is really a shame because the werewolves should have been the highlight of the game. That should have been when the game was at its best and offered you something interestingly different from fighting regular humans. But no, it's just the same repetitive mess that's really more annoying than anything else. Now, these werewolf fights would be the worst part of the game if it weren't for the few stealth segments that were added. See, the game starts off with what looks like very standard, common stealth elements that are added into an action game. You walk around crouched a lot, and you have to walk up to an enemy to press a button and silently kill them. The thing is, it looks as though the devs realized that they created a very standard and fairly boring stealth experience, so to try to spice things up, they added a QuickTime event to how you silently kill enemies. The thing is, what it does now is just make silently killing enemies all the more annoying, because if you try to attack them too quickly, they somehow develop superhuman reflexes, turn around, and shoot you in the face. The only thing more annoying than this is the fact that if you have a ranged silent weapon, enemies are still able to kill you with a cutscene death as soon as they remotely spot you. So you could have your sights lined up on an enemy's head, and if he notices you before you pull the trigger, you lose complete control of the game, it changes to a cutscene, and you get shot in the face. Doesn't matter what you do. So while the core gameplay is mediocre at best, it definitely gets bogged down with stale enemies, stale level design, and awful segments that try to give you a little variety. The only aspect of the gunplay I really enjoyed is that I think they did a fairly good job with the gun designs. You get a few of the standards like, you know, shotguns, rifles, pistols, but there's a few interesting ones that mix things up a little bit. There's an arc gun that is the most broken thing in the game. It basically plays it for you by aiming in a general direction, holding the fire button, and watch an enemy on the screen die. And there's the Thermite Rifle, which is my favorite gun in the game because it's not overpowered like the arc gun, but still is very interesting and unique. It basically involves shooting a cloud of gas around an enemy, and then shooting a flare that sets that gas off and explodes. Really fun, really interesting. Probably the most fun I had in the game was when I was using the Thermite Rifle, because it was the one thing that stood out to me as being a fairly original experience. So what about the storyline? Oftentimes there are games where the gameplay is mediocre, but the story makes up for it. Not really in this case. The story is nothing special. The setting itself is fairly interesting. It's nice to finally see a Victorian setting in a major video game, and it does that whole kind of steampunk mix with, you know, interesting weapons and fighting werewolves and vampires and such. But beyond that, it all gets very tropey very quickly. All your teammates and characters are very stock, very identifiable, and very, very predictable. And what really makes all this worse is the fact that while the plot is okay at the start, it falls apart very quickly at the end once you realize nothing gets resolved at all. It basically looks as though the designers didn't realize there's a difference between setting up for a sequel and flat out ending before the third act. See, when you set up for a sequel, normally almost everything gets resolved within that one game with one loose end. You know, there's the one bad guy that's still at large, there's this one major question that isn't answered, there's that guy that helped you earlier that might actually be the major antagonist in the next game. That doesn't happen here. Instead, there are about 4 or 5 different major plot threads that are brought up, and none of them get resolved at the end of the game. It simply ends after you take down a secondary bad guy, which is just completely annoying, especially considering the fact that the game is only 5 hours long. Now this of course brings us to the biggest debate about the game: is it worth playing something that's so short? Well, part of the defense that Ready at Dawn had was that it's only 5 hours long if you make a beeline through the entire game. If you take your time exploring and reading everything, it'll take more like 10 or 12 hours. No, not true at all. I spent as much time as I could exploring every level, every nook and cranny, reading every letter I could find, and at most the experience was only about 6.5 hours. The amount of content that there is on the side, which usually boils down to a single room attached to a hallway, is never going to add up to 5 hours. It's an hour at most added. And this is really where I think the biggest problem I have with this game comes from, is the fact that it's not just 5 hours, it's 5 hours without any real reason to want to ever do any of it ever again. There are so many ways that you could add length to this game, and none of it was done. Even if the campaign was left as it is, you could add side modes. It could be competitive multiplayer, it could be co-op multiplayer against hordes of enemies, which works perfectly with this gameplay formula. And even if you didn't want to add side modes, you could do 2-player co-op in the storyline to give you a reason to maybe play it again with a different friend. Now, if you wanted to keep the game purely single player, there's still things you could have done. They could have added collectibles that could alter the ending of the game, like having a hidden cutscene, so you have a reason to go back and re-explore levels, but there's none of that. You could have alternate choices in levels that could alter the storyline ever so slightly, or just change how a specific mission goes down. None of that occurs. Once you play through the game the first time, you have seen basically everything there is to see, which just makes the 5 hours all the more insulting. I think what really bothers me the most about this game is that from what's here, you could tell that something better could have been made. So much time and effort was spent on creating the basic tech for the game. It looks as though at one point the designers realized, oh crap, we created all this awesome tech, but we haven't made a game around it yet, so they just threw together a quick 5-hour campaign to set up a sequel. Which really, if that's the case, the sequel might actually be a good game if it ends up being longer, uses the same tech, and has more interesting and varied level design. But as this one stands on its own currently, it's just not worth spending $60 on. Now, normally I would argue with games that I found to be somewhat mediocre that, hey, if you don't want to wait for a price drop because you want to play the co-op, it might be worth spending $60 for you right now. I don't see myself making that argument with this game at all. You should definitely wait for the game to drop to at least 15 or 20 bucks, because at that point, at least you're going to feel like you got your money's worth as far as length of time goes, but you're still going to be a little disappointed with how the storyline pans out and how nothing gets resolved. resolved. So to sum up, The Order 1886 is a great looking, beautiful game that definitely could pan out to being something more in a more fully developed sequel, but this game by itself, just not worth spending $60 on whatsoever. Definitely wait for a price drop. 15 or 20 bucks would be worth it. Anything more, it's just gonna be a waste of your money because you're gonna pick it up, finish the whole game in a single night in 5 to 6 hours, and then you'll be done.
Well, that was my review of The Order 1886. As always, guys, I do have that game linked down below if you want to pick it up despite my warnings. I'd really heavily recommend against it this time, though. If you enjoyed the video, as always, make sure to let me know by hitting that thumbs up button, as well as subscribing if you haven't yet. I've got more content on the way soon. But till then, though, I'm Kevin Kenton, and I'll see you guys later.